Go ahead and get started. This is my talk, Building Sturdy Foundation, program-based approach to IT operations and InfoSec in business. Let's talk for a minute about our objectives. Understanding the challenge we face, both as practitioners and advocates of security and secure practices. We're going to frame the impact both on us and really kind of why we as security practitioners do what we do. Define some basic paths to success. We're not going to go into great detail because I am covering a lot of areas, but I will give you, or hopefully leave you, in a place where you can kind of gauge where your successes are at and add to them with some good foundational steps. And really, ultimately, all that's meant to drive better conversations about security. Now, obligatory disclaimer, this stuff is a result of research I've been doing. It's not in any way related to any of my employers, colleagues, or associates. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Stephen Legg. I'm a senior network communications and security engineer in the financial industry. I am a mentor. I do a lot of things up in Michigan with MySec and DLESec. I was a former IT director. I've worn a lot of hats, been an engineer. I've been IT manager. I've been a security engineer, and formerly an entrepreneur. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at ZenMode. I'm also a founding member, as I mentioned, of DLESec, which is a capture the flag education group that tries to deliver low-cost training and practical skills to folks in the community. And I'm also a POSHSEC developer. You should check out POSHSEC if you haven't yet, and you're a Windows admin looking to do security stuff in your environment. So the story I'm going to tell you is probably one you've heard, right? Management gets their panties in a bunch about compliance. They see big hacks in the news. They want to do something about it. So naturally, their risk officers, or maybe this company doesn't have a CISO, maybe it's just not quite big enough. A lot of smaller companies don't. All the board members get together, talk about numbers, business. They all feel really good. They get their chests all puffed up. Then the CEO walks out, talks to the IT director, talks to the CFO, or whoever might be responsible for IT ultimately in your org, and says, make it so. Let's do this. Meanwhile, everybody underneath them is going, holy crap. This is not a security program, guys. We're not going to achieve the results we want doing this. The end is near. And then, we go through a bunch of different things. We check all the boxes. We do the things that are mandated by the governance we fall under. And then we're left in a state where we really don't even want to look at what's going on. Management, when we bring up the fact that compliance does not equal security, starts executing, blinders and solving all their problems by just ignoring it. And then your director looks around, looks at your team, looks at the operational fires, the latest push from your app dev folks, and is like, well, we have no budget, or time really, so to hell with it. I'm too broke for this shit. So everybody in the org has their head in the sand. They're all thinking, gosh, it's a good thing we're compliant. It's a great thing we're compliant. Everything's fine. We're doing great. And then something bad happens. And then your completely unplanned, undefined IR looks something like this. We throw a bucket of water on a raging fire. So all of that leaves us in a place where we're waist deep, shoulder deep in tribbles. We've got all these things that we know we need to do. We've got all this stuff that is piling up. We've got threat intelligence. We've got all these things. You know, we're reading articles. We're staying on top of it. We're the dedicated folks that are really trying to make a difference, right? But we can't. We can't because all these people are not lining up. And so then, after we put out the fire, that day's fire, we stand there, all stoic, very, very morbid. Winter's coming. Winter's coming, guys. And by the way, I'm way more hip in security than you are. I knew winter was coming before it was cool. But the reality is, even we are wrong, because winter's already here. Whether we're talking about heartbleed, venom, any major vulnerability, any major shift. I don't know if you guys have heard of, I'm going to get this name wrong. It's a stenography vulnerability that just recently was released last week that allows the embedding, using some exploits of certain HTML5 elements, allows the embedding of malicious code in image files, JPEGs and PNGs. So, to you I say, you know nothing, Jon Snow. Because ultimately, 60%, and this is from the Verizon DBIR, 60% of incidents were attributed to errors made by sysadmins or other folks that were responsible in engineering in some way for the implementation of those systems. Now, a lot of us that work in like mid-market businesses, we're not huge enterprise, we're not small, we're just in the middle. We're the middle child. Know that a lot of these companies don't necessarily either have the mindset or the money or both to invest in a well-funded security program. And that's everything from getting the right products and solutions in place to having people that are trained and on hand only doing security, right? So what do we do about it? How do we, in that situation, our back's against the wall, our management's back's against the wall, the board doesn't know that their back's against the wall, but it is. How do we fix that? Well, one good place to start, and I'm sure you've all heard of this, the SANS organization puts out critical security controls. These controls, while they can be very deep and time-consuming to implement, around 40% of them are what I would consider quick wins, things that you can do probably in like a 3 to 4 month span. That could be very effective at greatly improving your security posture. For those of you that haven't seen SANS, you can go check it out at this URL. So SANS is great. Me just mentioning SANS is great. I'm sure that's not at all remotely useful, and I'll get into some things there hopefully are. But the point I want to make here is that when you're looking at the SANS controls and you're looking at drastically trying to create disproportionate change in your org, right? You want the small amount of time you have to invest to translate into big results. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. If you can identify in your org what that 20% of actions are to generate both technical and vulnerability mitigating results that reduce your attack surface, you don't just get that result, right? Ultimately, the goal of that is to drive that into a narrative that you can use to frame security more effectively to management and to the board, to the people that should care but don't necessarily have the right language or shared meaning to understand or care. And what that translates into directly, the end result, right? Once you have management buy-in, they're accounting for it in budget. When your IT and operations folks are planning different changes, life cycle refreshes, everything else, they're baking in that security from the start. They're adding it to those programs and projects on an ongoing basis and in a way that is sustaining and sustainable. So, enough concepts. Let's talk about some ways that this has been done. Again, I'm not going to be able to go into extreme detail, but because we're covering so many different areas. But I want to leave you guys with an approach that will hopefully help you impact some change in your organizations. So when we talk about the things that we need, things that make a difference, the things that have implications of security, even if they're not necessarily an area that InfoSec traditionally presides over, right? These are all important. You know, there's many subcategories underneath these. I'm not going to get into a lot of that. You know, we could extrapolate this out to be a massive list. But when we talk about these things, what we really need to understand is how we're measuring success, right? There's tons of security metrics out there. People love to list the number of vulnerabilities they have and the number they mitigated. They like to talk about, you know, a lot of things that don't directly really espouse the value of this stuff. And so what I did was took the capability maturity model, adapted it to this purpose, and tried to kind of create a common understanding at each one of those programs. And for those of you that haven't seen the CMM, these are the different levels. I think these are just summarized versions of this. But so for each one of these areas, the goal was to get an understanding of where we were starting and then where we got to over a 6-month period. The bottom line is there is a lot. You're not going to be able to do everything, so you got to prioritize. But ultimately, you need to stay calm, stay focused, and do the things that you can do at the times that you can do them. A lot of people, when they talk about security or they talk about implementing security, they don't consider the reality for a lot of folks, especially in the mid-market. And that reality is that you're just as much a sysadmin or help desk employee as you are a security engineer or admin. You know, a lot of folks that I talk to, friends that work in the industry, people I know that are doing this every day, are only getting, 6 to 8 hours a week to actually do InfoSec specific stuff. That's not a lot of time. It's certainly not a lot of time when you're trying to implement all those key programs that are required to actually push that conversation forward. So let's keep calm. Let's do it together. Let's make it happen. So the first area I want to talk about is asset management. Whether you may or may not know it, asset management is the basically ongoing inventory and monitoring of assets and their use within the org. It has implications far and wide. I mentioned here financial and contractual and inventory functions. Those things are all important because they have ramifications even outside security, but security can be somebody that brings light to these things in a way that makes it more accessible even to folks outside of our departments, right? So what asset management helps us stop is things like theft or minimize. We can't stop everything, right? But things like theft, misuse, John borrowing Jane's laptop and taking files off of it, somebody logging into someone else's machine that they shouldn't have access to, and doing bad things. Now, a lot of us, I think, in the asset management realm, especially in the mid-market, even in enterprise and large companies, we have these lists, right? We have purchase lists with serial numbers and values and the rev level of all of our stuff. We know when we bought it. We know who has it. We know where it is. We know roughly what it's doing. But we don't really have any kind of great way to keep up with that on an ongoing basis. And I'll get more into how we accomplish that later. So capacity management is essentially just the function of monitoring, analyzing, and integrating our understanding of workloads, whether that's compute, storage, could be any number of things. The implications of those things on both our security posture, in the context of a denial of service attack, whether that's internal or external, but also helps us plan for operations, the growth and expansion of our business functions on those platforms that we utilize, right? So change management has multiple facets. On the app dev side of the world, change management is really important in terms of the SDL process. In the IT operations department, which is where I think it's less utilized and less visible, really should be following the same methodology, right? We want to vet out changes and risks before we make them. And what that does is facilitate the efficient and prompt handling of changes in the circumstance where you're actually monitoring those things, right? And that manages risks related to that change impact, keeps you from exposing new vulnerabilities or creating, bigger attack surface unintentionally. Communications management, I've defined as the planning, implementing, and monitoring of all communication channels in the business. Now, this is not where a SIM program would live. This is more talking about how data moves through a network in use, right? You have emails going out. You have, communication sessions from client applications to server applications doing things. You have vendors that have connections into your network. Maybe you're a securities company and you have somebody monitoring your website. How does that vendor get access? That kind of thing. Configuration management is talking about how we define and manage that pristine state of assets within our network, whether it's a firewall, an endpoint, it could be a phone, could be any number of things, a workstation. Some of the extremities of configuration management, the way we do that, right, is we manage patches, push out patches, we white or blacklist applications, we look at policy settings and things like that. And this helps us manage those risks that relate to non-standard system states. And what I mean by that is we prevent bad things from getting on our machines, and we keep those machines from being internally exploited and used in a way we don't intend. So moving on to data management, really what this does is help us classify and understand what data we have, how it should be used, and who needs access to it, what use cases actually exist for it. DLP is a part of this. Data classification, as I mentioned, and other data protection controls. If you're big enough or you have a deep enough warehouse of data, like say you have some databases with a lot of client or other information that's sensitive, maybe it's PII, maybe it's PHI. Those things, maybe you have a filter mechanism for input-output on your database for your whatever applications are serving it. But really what all that does is prevents the theft and misuse of that data by parties authorized or unauthorized to use it. Event management, really what we're talking about here is how we are monitoring and then alerting on ongoing activities in the network. This assists us in staying aware and basically is the set of eyes that we have on our org, right, on all of our infrastructure. So that obviously has deep implications in many areas. Identity and access management, really at a bottom line, just make sure that the people that are supposed to be doing what they're doing are those people, and they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And what that does, translated, remote workers, folks that are using VPN, folks that aren't using VPN, folks that are moving data in and out of the network, they're copying their files onto their laptop when they shouldn't be, and leaving, and then that laptop gets stolen out of their car. This prevents, or correct implementation of this prevents that unauthorized or unintended access, or makes it much harder for them to do that, right? And that way we want to be kind of annoying. But, so moving on to incident management, IR, or IM, IR, really we're talking about that plan, right? Something bad happens. Security fire starts. Security fires are always scary. Security fire starts, what do we do? What data do we need to collect? Who do we need to give it to? How do we need to maintain its state? All those things are involved, and much more than that. But what that does is assists with shortening that path to containment, right? When we're talking about IR, that's one of the goals of IR, is we want to minimize the damage. And so successful IM programs involve that very deeply. Now, I've defined infrastructure management here as basically the architecture and design of your controls environment. So that's your everything from the way you construct things from an operations perspective to facilitate the use cases that you need for your software and hardware. But also as an extension of that, enabling those use cases while keeping security as a focus and an objective within that context. So every point of articulation within that IT infrastructure, whether it's an application, a database, a workstation, a server, a switch, it doesn't really matter, but we should be thinking about how all of those pieces fit together. And I'll get more into that a little bit later. IT continuity management is basically describing what our BCP DR looks like, how we're approaching it, what our RTO RPO is, and from a security perspective, how we're ensuring that that environment and that process remains secure from start to finish. A lot of companies think about their BCP DR plans, and they do a lot. They may have very well thought out plans. But then when you go and look at their BCP DR environments or the infrastructure they have set up to deal with those problems when they do arise, because they will, as we know, those environments have 10 to 20% or less of the controls that their production environments have. And that's a huge problem, right? Because if you are an attacker, so the way that I've had those conversations in the past really has been around framing risks and risks as they relate to our use cases for hardware and software in the environment, right? So we've got, BCP DR. We've got a QA system, for developers. Why is it important to secure those? If I'm an attacker, let's say I'm on your network and I haven't made my presence known. I've done almost nothing aside from establishing a foothold somewhere. What am I going to do if I'm just observing? I'm going to look at all the areas that you have, what baseline looks like, right? I'm going to look at what I can poke around in and not make too much noise. I'm going to gather that information and then plan my attack for a moment when I know it'll be most effective. Sure. Mm-hmm. No, I think that's core to the issue, right? So we're talking about what someone would do in your case with access to QA, right? Or some stage of the SDL process where they have the ability to insert that code or that backdoor. They do that, nightmare scenario is going to happen. So that's why it's so critical that we protect those environments as if they were production, because they contain all the same data as production. And that's probably what, in that conversation, that would be one of the things that I highlight and have highlighted when explaining why those controls are so important. Because the scenario you just described is exactly one that could happen, right? Yeah, I believe it. I think it happens all the time, and a lot of people don't pay attention to it. Anyway, so does that answer your question? All right, cool. So lifecycle management, a lot of folks only think of lifecycle management or don't think a lot of it on the IT ops side. When they think lifecycle, they're always thinking SDL. They're always thinking of it from an app dev or DevOps perspective. But really what lifecycle management is making sure that everything that you're doing on an ongoing basis from start to finish, over like a 10, 15, however many years their business is operating, that you've got current equipment that is built in such a way that it enables both your operations functions, so that it has the capacity to do what you need, right? But also has the capacity to do what you need in a secure way, from our perspective as security practitioners. From an app dev perspective, it's also that process to control how our change management impacts the delivery of our services, whether that's IT ops or app dev, and then how we manage risks around those things. So vulnerability management's our last one. Most of you are probably familiar with vulnerability management programs. Really all we're doing is looking at what we have in place. We're inventorying potential vulnerabilities, risks that we have, and coming up with ways to prioritize and deal with those things. So what that translates into, practically speaking, for other areas of the business is, that ongoing configuration management. It's coding practices. It's making sure that change management's properly followed by validating using your vulnerability management program, and then addressing those non-compliant applications and systems. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, we have a common understanding of what I mean by all those program areas. Let's get into the case studies. Business One is a manufacturing single-site company. They fabricate plastics. They have about 120 users. About 40 of those are office employees. The rest are shop floor employees. And so this business has, like most manufacturing companies, a very tight IT budget. In manufacturing, their margins are not big. They're small, and they have to scrape for every penny they get. So when we look at what they have, while they don't have mature implementations of every one of these areas, even in areas where they have things in place, they have, this is the general state of their programs. So they were struggling most figuring out how to implement a capacity management program. Their IT ops folks didn't know much about monitoring systems. And from a configuration management perspective, they didn't really have any understanding of some of the automation frameworks that you can use to make that easier. From a data management perspective, they didn't understand what types of data they had. They didn't really get how to classify things like their intellectual property, their designs, all of their 3D rendered images, versus their personally identifiable information of their employees, their contract information, their clients, all of that stuff. And they definitely did not have an incident management program. They hadn't even thought of it. They didn't have anything together. So business number 2 is a finance organization. They're a small bank. They had multiple locations, around 280 users. Those were all office employees or client-facing staff. Their main focus was on compliance, being compliant under PCI regulations, and they had a few other systems that they were specifically concerned with, but I won't get into those. So where they were at, they had a much stronger understanding of their controls that most directly map to their compliance program, because that's what their management pushed on a lot of their engineering team. And so what they lacked were the kind of underpinnings, right? The things that they're not really thinking about, the things that aren't really coming up a whole lot in that PCI and those other standards that they were using. So business number 3 is a healthcare organization. They're multi-site. They have over 400 users. Probably about half of those were medical professionals, practitioners, that were interfacing with patients. The rest was office staff and other folks. So where they were most focused was on areas that specifically helped them, again, from a compliance perspective, help them meet those HIPAA and high-tech requirements, right? They were most focused on the things that kept fees and fine conversations off their back, especially the board. That was what was the board mostly concerned with. Yes? Mm-hmm. No, it's okay. That's okay. Mm-hmm. 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 So when you say users, what kind of users are you talking about? Mm-hmm. Mm. So I think so. I'll answer your question a couple ways. One, I would say when you're looking to verify, like what you're describing right there, when you want those users to validate it, the best way to approach that or kind of head that off as an issue is to have a well documented, well defined, demonstrated process for collecting that information in the event that you want those users to do it, right? Now, there's not everybody's going to have a use case where their users are being dependent on to collect that data. Maybe we do it, over the network. What I found very valuable in that regard, and I'll go into this too as we get to because I'm going to cover each one of these areas in the case studies and talk about how we addressed some of those concerns. So we, as a general rule, what I like to do is depend on IT operations monitoring products that can pull that data live and actively to make it less we need to manually check this stuff and more let's generate a report every week, every month, every quarter, whatever your particular use case requires. And on an ongoing basis, review and then, basically diff those results, to state it plainly. Keep things focused on activities that are actually producing results for your team, for your org, and away from manual stuff that's just spending a lot of your time and energy doing it. It's completely reasonable in the event that you didn't have, a monitoring product like that to help you with that. And a lot of companies don't. But if you can, and if you can implement an open source solution, maybe, in the case where you don't have money to purchase something that's a paid product, that's a really, I think, useful way to automate that process. And automation is a key in all these programs, right? We want to make it simple, easier. We don't want to spend a lot of time collecting data or doing things. We want to focus on interpreting and communicating those results out to folks that can have an impact on us, make our job easier, make them more secure. Everybody wins. So does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. So let's talk about the constraints that these companies and all companies have, right? There's, the top one, budget. Everybody's constrained by budget. Doesn't matter how big you are. You still have to make decisions on how you chop up the pie you've got. You can't eat, as a general rule, most companies don't just let any purchase or shifting a budget or use of budget over 5 to 10% of the budget go unapproved without some kind of review process, right? Then you've got the people that do it. Those people have workloads. They have other things. As I mentioned, in the mid-market business space, security engineers are not just security engineers. They're also help desk people or, operations folks or the developers. I've seen any number of mix matches of that same situation in a lot of companies I've consulted with. Then there's the experience problem. How do you keep your personnel up to date? How do you keep their skills fresh? How do you keep them focused on that 20% of activities? That means 80% of the results if they don't have time. They're not going to spend all their evenings poring over, the latest vulnerabilities that have come out. They're not necessarily interested in that, right? They're not all security practitioners. And even those that are don't have time. They have families. They've got things they do outside of work, which leads, a lack of experience leads to a lack of understanding on how to effectively use those tools. The tools, whether they're open source, paid, whatever, that exist out there in the world are designed to make this job easier, right? But if we don't have the experience, we don't have the time, which I'll get to in a second, we can't effectively use any of that. So time is the last one. It's also one of the most important. Everything we do as a security practitioner costs time. But I think when we talk about how to deal with those constraints, we talk about how to actually make an impact without doing a lot of tire spinning. We really need to use the stuff we have. We need to use the personnel we've got, the resources we have, and make it work, right? That's an old IT ops mantra. Make it work. Whatever it takes, get it up and running. Keep it up. So let's look at how we've done that. I'm going to have to go a little bit fast through these. I apologize because I don't want to run over on time. So in Business One, I'm talking specifically about asset management. And to review, this is what asset management, or how I've defined it, or for our purposes here. What we did for them, or what I did for them, was developed using their remote monitoring and management platform, which I'll talk about in a second, a quarterly inventory, and then an auditing process that generated that software and hardware list that we could monitor changes with week to week, month to month. And then we used that quarterly and annual report that was driven out of that data to support our lifecycle management process. So some of the ways we collected that data, using that our RMM, the remote monitoring and management platform, we queried their Active Directory for information on those machines that they had on the network. LabTech was the solution. So LabTech has the ability to audit systems on an ongoing basis, and it can use WMI. It can use, it's got its own kind of scripting language and data collection mechanism that just looks at the registry and some other things. And so that was how we drove a lot of that. So business number 3, once again, this was the healthcare org. We were talking about capacity management. They were in a situation, this is capacity management as we've defined it here today. They were in a situation where their assets were oversubscribed. A lot of their EMR system and some of specifically their X-ray and other delivery platforms were 10, 15 years old. A lot of hospitals and practitioners are in that situation, right? They can't afford necessarily to refresh the systems that are associated with those, because if they refresh the computer that's attached to it and controlling it, they have to change the whole platform because they're not compatible, right? Those platforms are designed with specific use cases in mind for their software, for that vendor. So what we did is we classified the volatility of all of those things, how much they varied in workload and performance, and how much of an operational impact it had. Generated weekly and monthly reports using, for the Windows-based systems, Performance Monitor. And then performed a quarterly review of those numbers on an ongoing basis to adjust the approach and manage that capacity. So I mentioned Performance Monitor. It's very useful. It's part of the sysinternals suite. Another thing we did was implement Nagios for the non-Windows systems. I put Zabbix on here because Zabbix is a great open source project that built on Nagios and is a little more sophisticated in terms of the way it reports, from my experience. So let's talk about now business number 1 and change management. So again, change management ensures that those standardized procedures are being followed. It ensures that we're validating that those procedures are being followed. And for these guys, we formed a change control board from appropriate management and IT staff, leveraging their existing ticketing system as the driver of that validation, and then connected their compliance team with the reporting driven out of that system for verification. So there was a loop of accountability, right? That helps drive dialogue, because those are then you can report on those numbers and create business cases for things to upper management that they'll understand, because it'll translate into something that more than one person is explaining and espousing to them. So they used Service Manager as one of their ticketing platforms. That was on the AppDev side. On the IT operations side, they also had ConnectWise, which, if you're not familiar with that, this is a tool. It's actually a PSA that's used primarily by IT operations managed service providers. We also provided their AppDev folks with the OWASP SDLC cheat sheet to kind of help them get their SDL process, the change management piece of their SDL process, kind of more up to snuff. So moving on to the next three, we're going to talk about communications management. Communications management, again, we're just talking about how data is moving around a network and how we're managing where it can go. In this case, I worked with their outsourced IT vendor. They had an MSP that managed their IT plant. Basically, we air-gapped it. We VLAN'd everything off. We put filtering restrictions between those VLANs, ACLs. And then we enabled logging on their switching and other network infrastructure up the stack to know when exceptions were happening. So if somebody were doing a port scan, we'd see it. It would rattle those cages because we've configured those assets to actually monitor it. And then, of course, encrypt all the things. They didn't have a lot of budget, so using some open source encryption platforms are good for them. They were actually an Office 365 user. Again, they're really heavily outsourced company, right? Manufacturing. So they use Office 365, and for those of you that don't know, Office 365 actually has encrypted email functionality built into it. I didn't know that until I worked with this client and was researching it. But in the case of designs and other things that they were sending to clients or working with clients on, this made it a lot more secure for them to do that, right? Because we don't have proprietary company IP sitting in the sales guy's inbox, who's probably going to get popped in all reality. They also had Symantec endpoint protection and a pretty big relationship with Symantec. The CEO loved them for some reason. So they were already in conversations with them about a DLP solution, and so we ended up implementing that alongside it. So let's talk about configuration management. Once again, this is speaking to the management of that pristine state and prevention of things that would change it. For this business, we leveraged that integrated Active Directory functionality to enforce it. So that using application whitelisting, group policy, things that would effectively, for all those machines, maintain that pristine state. This company actually had no patch management at all. So we implemented WSUS. It's free if you have licenses for your Windows servers and whatnot. And that really helped them kind of bring that up to the next level. And then we used the software restriction policy to manage software system state. So in addition to the application whitelisting, we stopped those processes, any processes that didn't belong to the baseline, from talking and doing things on their machines. So business number 3, we're going to talk about data management. I apologize, I know I'm running through this really fast. I'm coming up on time. So we've defined data management as the basically classification and specific allowing or disallowing of data usage and use cases. So we ended up implementing a DLP solution with these folks. It turned out that they were already in conversations with several vendors, and they ended up implementing something comparable to what the manufacturing client I just mentioned put in place. But they had basically an outsourced development company that provided them with some of their like imaging platform equipment and software, and so those folks recommended another similar product. But basically, we worked with them to identify and restrict access to that data and those data warehouses on a use case basis. Not everybody needs access to the EMR. Just because, the IT director wants access to everything, wants domain admin, wants all the things, doesn't mean he should have it, right? So we tuned that down, paired it in, and kind of implemented that with them. We also talked to them about OpenSAM, which is, if you're not familiar with OWASP, that's their the framework for managing SDL. So let's move on to IT continuity and vulnerability management. I have not talked about IM yet, and that's last for a reason, because there's a little bit more to say about it. So from an event management perspective, again, we're talking about how we monitor activity. Basically, we adjusted those domain event log settings to maximize the effectiveness of their SIM. They ran an open source SIM here. And then set up quarterly exercises to help them test specific abuse cases. So I'm scared of Poodle. I'm scared of Heartbleed. I'm scared of this or that. Okay, let's test it on a quarterly basis based on whatever, threat intelligence and other focuses there might be in the business, right? Because those exercises are a great way to highlight to management where we're falling down, where we're standing up, celebrating the good, addressing the bad, and creating, again, that accountability conversation with them. For those of you that have not managed an event management program, or maybe you have, if you haven't seen ultimatewindowsecurity.com, they have a deep body of resources on correct ways to configure logging levels to help you maximize the effect of your SIM and prevent white noise, right? Because with SIMs, the big challenge is you often have too much data. You're getting alerted on too much and it doesn't matter and it's not actionable. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't looked, take a look at Ultimate Windows Security. So IT continuity management. Again, this is talking about the BCPDR situation, both from a controls perspective and a business continuity perspective. This particular business, which is alarming, they were a healthcare provider, and they were not testing annually their DR plan. They weren't testing even remotely their data recovery plan. Somebody deletes a share or blows up, a server blows up, loses drives, or their SAN takes a dump. They weren't testing any of those use cases. So what we did was we set those up and then created metrics around their performance and the performance of the control infrastructure to create visibility to management and, again, create that accountability conversation that'll push that narrative forward. Vulnerability management for business number 2. Again, VM is, identifying, indexing, prioritizing, and fixing those vulns that you find. Again, they were a financial industry, so we subscribed them to FS Isaac and some other alert and vulnerability communities to provide that additional threat intelligence so they could prioritize what they wanted to, right? And they connected their InfoSec staff using that threat intelligence with their IT operations group to help enhance their patch management program. So now we'll talk about these last couple areas. I'm going to blow through these pretty quick because I really want to get to the IM. Infrastructure management, again, is all about the way you architect your systems to be secure and how you're baking it in. You're not taking bread out of the oven and putting flour in it when it's half cooked, right? So CIS benchmarks are great there. CIS benchmarks, if you're not familiar with them, you should go look at them. They're essentially a set of standard settings for all different types of systems that are a, quote, hardened state. Generally, about half of them have recommendations and half of them have definitions where they say, look at this, determine if this setting is applicable from a security perspective for your use case, and then decide whether or not you're going to implement that control. Another big one that I mentioned before was air gapping. Basically the logical separation of networks based on need to use or need to know. That was another big one we did there. From a lifecycle management perspective, we really were seeking in this use case to cross-pollinate that information from their configuration management. This is on the IT ops side. So a lot of it was getting those folks together, getting them talking, and getting them looking at ways to automate those things. From an IAM perspective, they ended up using federated services. or we moved them to federated services so that they had authentication for all of their extremities, because they worked with a few vendors that had ties into some of their systems, and so it was important that we authenticated those people with the same security controls as everyone else. Which brings me to the last section, IAM, incident management. Again, this is how we respond to things that are going on. For all of these use cases, the things that, and what I would recommend you look at if you haven't dug deep into an IAM conversation yourself, go through, Google the top three. Incident Management 101, Incident Handling Process for Small and Medium Businesses, Incident Handler's Handbook. These are great baseline resources that give you kind of foundational knowledge and framework for setting up your IAM program. This is all from SANS, by the way. They're great guys. And also the incident forms support these things by giving you standardized documentation templates for capturing each phase of your IAM IR program. I'll leave this up for a second. I know we're coming up on time, so I'm going to try to finish this out. So, and now for something completely different. Not really, though. To summarize, winter's here. We know it's here. It's cold. We know we're too broke for this shit. And we also know that we need to collectively stay calm and move forward together. That's us as security practitioners. That's us as business people, professionals. That's us as people in a world where our job and responsibility is to protect all of the lives that our systems touch. That's really our job, right? We're the sentries. We're the only thing stopping a criminal from taking from people that don't deserve to be taken from. So once again, I'm Stephen Legg. You can find me on Twitter at ZenMode. This has been Building a Sturdy Foundation. Thank you very much.